One. Howdy, folks. It's your host, Lee Larson, and you're here with Follow the Leader another week. And joining us from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is Dillon Naber Cruz, the Tattooed Theologian. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to sit down and talk to you.
Absolutely. Folks, Dillon Naber Cruz is one of the lead on the podcast God Squad. He considers himself the Tattooed Theologian. That's how you can identify him on socials. Former Marine. Very much leaning into the master's in religion that you received in Lancaster Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. And you are the author of Go Golden, Applying a Universal Religious a Teaching and Ethics of Permaculture. You also have a second book that I can't read my handwriting. I'm so sorry.
It's
But
okay. I have a second and third book, actually.
you do.
Theological Musings, Volumes 1 and 2, Collected Essays of a Tattooed Theologian. All of my titles are mouthfuls.
I appreciate them. And your blog especially. Tell us, Dillon, tell us about your journey. You served in the Marines. Now you're getting your master's in religion. What was your upbringing? And thank you for your service, first of
Yeah.
all.
Well, I grew up in two very conservative fundamentalist traditions, the Southern Baptist Church and the Church of Christ. Joined the Marine Corps right out of high school, got married to the first woman who paid attention to me, who was actually a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So, I was immersed in that fundamentalist world for a long time. And then after I got out of the Marine Corps, she joined the Army and became a chaplain. Last time I checked, she was a colonel. She probably got kicked out because Pete Hegseth doesn't like women in ministry or women in the military. And I walked away from Christianity in 2003, and I kind of wandered in the spiritual wilderness for a long time. I started seminary in 2016, and I graduated with that master's in religion in 2018. And my master's thesis ended up being my first book. It turned out that my calling was not being a pastor as such, but more of a public theologian and a writer. And so I've used that writing platform to then become, sort of the tattooed theologian, which I think is apt because I do have 13 tattoos, and a couple of them are theological. Some of them aren't, but and then I started doing the God Squad on Sirius XM with John Fugelsang, with my co-host December Rose, and that proved to be so popular that we started the God Squad pod, which we do pretty much every week, and we talk about Christian nationalism and where faith and politics and culture, particularly culture war issues, intersect, and how that is leading us into this sort of fascist kakistocracy that's going on now with the MAGA regime and all the Christian nationalists that, like Russell Vogt, who are in, the deepest parts of that administration. So, you know, I, I I push back a lot against fundamentalism, the kind of fundamentalism that I grew up with, the kind that says you can use the Bible as a weapon. You can destroy the planet because God's going to make us a new one someday. I'd literally heard that from my now ex-wife, because in those circles, inexplicably to me, capitalism is seen as this very godly thing, and anything that we can do to enhance our profit-making ability is going to be more important than taking care of the planet that we live on, which seems a little backwards to me, or a lot backwards to me. So yeah, I coined a term. It's not in any theological textbooks yet, but hopefully someday. Fundamentalist fuckwittery, uh, and that's it's kind of broadly describes a set of beliefs that is, to me, intellectually, spiritually, and morally bankrupt, and starting with the idea that the Bible is an inerrant collection of texts that speaks to every single issue at every step of the way, despite being thousands of years removed from when it was written redacted and compiled.
And that's we're seeing that, particularly when you look at, your books. You're deconstructing from this fundamentalism. You care so much about the planet. You're talking about this. Um, this capitalism and fundamentalism is deeply intertwined, and it's also you see it and you see it, okay? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and also individual salvation.
Right.
Um, like
Yeah.
there's this like I just need to and it's very much focused on the self. What was that like to deconstruct?
Painful. Uh, because when you grow up in that world, everything is interconnected, and the locus of the points of connection is your fundamentalist certitude. And 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 the context that I grew up in, it was this certitude of white supremacy, and that the Bible was an inerrant collection of text, and we called it the Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth Manual, Bible, you know, that kind of thing. And I was, to be frank, I was angry when I learned a lot of things that I had to unlearn, when I learned about the things that I thought I knew and started unlearning them. And that process really began for me outside of the church. It began in academic circles. So my my undergraduate degree is in history, and I started studying history academically, and there was just a lot of stuff that was not adding up in comparison to what I was taught both in high school and then as a Marine, and then as a person who was in the church, in Baptist church kind of circles and that sort of thing. So I was angry a lot when that happened. And then when I walked away from the church because of an incident in 2003 where my wife was the chaplain at this chapel on an army base. Every week they would take prayer requests, and every week I was like in my head going, "Somebody please pray that there's no war," because this was before the Iraq Part 2 that happened in 2003. And then one day a guy came into a Sunday school room for little kids where I was putting out learning materials, and he said, "Bush has had enough. We're going to war, baby." In a church. And I granted, it was an army installation. But in my head, I was like, I don't see Jesus in that anywhere. I don't see Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, in that anywhere. So I literally put the papers down, turned around, and walked out without a word. And it shocked my then wife, and she was like, "What was that all about?" And you can't be excited about going to kill brown people who are poor and who pose no threat to you and still call yourself a follower of Jesus. So when I started to deconstruct, I read some books by Bart Ehrman, who a lot of people might know. He's one of the top New Testament scholars in the country, who just recently retired from UNC Chapel Hill. And his popular works, like Misquoting Jesus, for example, were just, mind blowing, because I hadn't been to church in a couple of years by that time. But the information, I was like, why didn't anybody ever tell me these things when I was in church? And it just led to this painful unraveling of my whole worldview. It's like that thing that you're standing on that you think is solid is suddenly liquid, and now you're almost drowning. And so I went to seminary in part to continue that academic deconstruction, because the school I went to has world-class faculty, uh, and they take historical critical scholarship very, very seriously there. And it really helped me to see how scholars approach the Bible when they're not looking to have a confirmation bias of their particular agenda, right? So I grew up either reading the King James version or the New International Version. Wildly different text, than the new Revised Standard Version that we used in seminary. That one is the version that scholars generally say is as close to as you can get to the original. So all of those things helped me immensely to deconstruct, and then starting to go to church again at that time, I experienced God in ways that I hadn't really before. And it was completely outside the context of fundamentalism. There was no focus on going to hell. There was no focus on, uh, you know, there wasn't so much focus rather on you have to believe these exact right things. And it doesn't matter how you behave, which is how a lot of fundamentalists seem to be approaching life these days. So it helped me to further disentangle that fundamentalism from my life and to expose those places where embedded theology were still coming up for me, or religious trauma. You can't tell little kids that if they die tonight, they're going to go to hell forever without that leaving a very big mark, which is what literally happened to me as a 9-year-old.
Well, and thank you for sharing that, because it also lets me and the listeners and folks, um, particularly who were raised maybe like in a progressive church or just not in that world, who are looking at all of this and being like, how can you not see it? Like how, and it's like, it's not, it's so much, you're asking these folks to do a lot. Like it's, and because of how deep they're in it. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to change my mind, change my vote. It's an entire way of life and navigating the world and community. I mean, that's like, and that's what I think has been really interesting watching and listening to so many folks who are deconstructing is where they're finding community. Because you see folks that go the other way and reject religion outright. They're done. I don't want anything. I'm burned. I've been hurt. But then you have folks like you who are like, well, actually, I think there's a different way to look at it. One of the things that I was particularly keen on was you talking about this going straight from high school to a Marine. On your blog, you also talk about Doug Wilson. Was Doug Wilson, for those who are unfamiliar, is rising not just in popularity but in influence, particularly in Washington, D.C., and with this MAGA movement. There's a heavy emphasis, folks, I know that you have been listening, of creating America to be a Christian government, theonomy, this whole theological worldview that the reason America has the ills that we have is because we're just not practicing the right Christianity. Was that you going into the Marines? Was that shaped by some of these voices, in the and not just Christian nationalist movement, but how was that Marine or military service tied to your fundamentalism?
Well, in that time, I graduated high school in 1990, so it's been a minute. But at that time, and still today, fundamentalist American Christians are very much into this idea of being patriotic Americans, and that there's this idea that America is somehow special in God's eyes. That does go back to sort of Christian nationalist viewpoints all the way back to the Puritans and people like John Winthrop and Cotton Mather and people like that in the 18th century, etc. So that it was kind of understood that military service was something honorable to do in that world. There's a complete sort of disconnect from the early Jesus movement for the first few hundred years of Christianity, of what became Christianity, in which, as Tertullian said, Christ, in disarming Peter, disarmed us all. And you couldn't become a Christian if you were a soldier who carried weapons of war, etc. But the entwinement of empire and Christianity that took place at the time of Constantine's ostensible conversion had flipped that script. And so for Americans, there was no sort of reflection, no interrogation in their mind about A, joining the military at all, and B, what is our military being used for? What kind of things are happening in foreign policy from a military standpoint look anything like the picture that we get of Jesus from the Gospels? Well, spoiler alert, not much. And so, I went to boot camp 11 days after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, back when George Herbert Walker Bush was president. So my boot camp experience was a lot of screaming and yelling that I was going to go to war and be blown to bits, and learning to locate, close with, and destroy my enemy, which is the first general order of the Marines. You locate, you close with, and then you destroy them by any means necessary. And we learned such brutally hand-to-hand combat techniques that I shudder to think of them now, right? I'm glad that I was never in combat despite serving in a time of war. I did not get deployed to the desert. The ground war ended right before my training as a heavy equipment engineer ended. So I never had to experience combat. But yes, definitely the idea that Christians should be patriotic Americans and serve their country in that way absolutely fed into why I joined the Marine Corps, but also because I grew up in a very small town with very limited opportunities and didn't see a way forward for me to go to college, etc. And that's a great way to get people who are 18 years old. Where else can you get a job at 18 that in your first year you're going to get all your medical and dental benefits, 30 days paid vacation every year? No job in America has that when you're 18. Oh, most jobs don't have that when you're 50, right? If you've been there a long time, you don't get 30 days vacation. It's a big hook, and it's something that in the fundamentalist circles is still incredibly important to them. That's why you see Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, and he's part of Doug Wilson's church.
Thank you for that, because that's particularly you're not questioning the state, like this assumption
Right.
that because America is special in the eyes of God, ergo America is doing what is divine, like it is, and yeah, and you see that in and that is too, like when folks have outrage about certain ways that particularly the military is used, or the rhetoric. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing on and because circling back to what you've written your books on is you know, permaculture, ethics of permaculture, ecological sustainability or ecological theology. Let's talk more about how Christian nationalism, with this very, it's almost like feverish is the way it's so intense. How is that playing a role in environmental regulations? Right. We talked about Pete Hegseth and how war's connected to this. How does that play out when we look at, regulations around environment?
Well, I read a book last year, the year before, by Dr. Kevin Cruz, who is a historian at Princeton, called One Nation Under God. And he talks about Andrew Feifeld, this guy who preached this sort of prosperity-ish kind of gospel. But in Feifeld's world, and amongst Christians who are very conservative, there's this idea that capitalism is from God, and the ultimate freedom is the ability to not have any limits on how much money you make. So environmental regulation is hampering your freedom. And you can see this very clearly in the Project 2025 document that came out in 2024, which I really wish people had paid more attention to while I was standing on the rooftop screaming, read Project 2025, this shit is bonkers, right? So the idea behind this is, again, there's this I don't, just abjectly stupid belief amongst Christian nationalists that what we do to the planet doesn't matter because ultimate freedom comes from making a profit, which is not something you will find in the New Testament literally anywhere. But also that there's this idea that stewardship doesn't matter. And these ideas carry over into a rejection of science. So you see it all the time. If you read the Project 2025 document, the EPA chapter, for example, or Russell Vought's chapter on the administrative state, they talk about climate change activism as if the people who think that you should have clean air and clean water and clean soil to grow your food in are terrorists, and the people who are destroying those vital ecosystems that God called good in Genesis, if you want to go there, are not the terrorist. And to me, that is wildly inverted. And so they believe that climate change isn't real, or at least they pretend to believe it. And that's where I'm really kind of confused, because I'm like, how do you look at what's going on in the world in terms of the disasters of climate change, of growing climate change, and not see that as a theological issue? I cannot separate my education from going to permaculture courses and teaching permaculture and writing about permaculture from theology. This is why Go Golden is my first book. And the idea behind that is, if you go golden, which I'm referencing Matthew 7:12, the golden rule, because Jesus says, in everything you do unto others as you would have them do to you. And in a globalized world, on a planet that is a closed biosphere, meaning that it is a closed ecological system, if you start destroying that thing here where I live, that's going to flow downstream somewhere and affect your neighbors. And if you start destroying the air, that's going to affect your neighbors. And, all of these kinds of things, these ecological issues, to me, are theological, because you can't love your neighbor by destroying their water. You can't love your neighbor by dropping bombs on them, which is an ecological catastrophe. Warfare is an ecological catastrophe. Just look at what's happening in Gaza right now. Or even what's happening in Minnesota, where they're using chemical weapons, some of which are highly carcinogenic, apparently, and just releasing that nonsense into the air, and it just goes wherever. Or every time you talk I featured Chad Bianco as the representative of fundamentalist fuckwittery for the week last night on the God Squad pod. He's running for governor in California, and part of his platform is deregulation. How does that make sense? Environmental deregulation, and he's like, so we can have less taxes. It's like they think that taxation is somehow this incredibly onerous thing, but in Romans, Paul says, pay your taxes.
Right.
He literally says that in, I think it's chapter 13, the one that they really like to quote whenever there's a conservative in power.
Oh, yeah.
And they say, you got to submit to the ruling authorities. Well, A, that's contextual to Paul's time and place, but B, it says pay your taxes. And if you want your taxes to go to something that looks more like the golden rule and the teachings of Jesus, and you don't spend, Donald Trump is now calling for a $1.5 trillion defense budget. That number doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense in 2015 when I wrote the chapter on politics, or on warfare, that the defense budget at that time was $500 million. And just 11 years, we've gone from just over $500 million to now Trump calling for $1 to $1.5 trillion in defense spending. And folks, I regret to inform you, we have not been invaded by a foreign power since 1812.
And I read that this week that we are the sole superpower. Like what we have done, like there what we're doing is grossly disproportionate to what the threat is.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
just it was talking about, okay, yeah, United States, you did it. You are the sole superpower now, but you have gone so far that way. It's very concerning because, I mean, as you said, you have studied history. You've seen what happens when empires collapse. And it's a dangerous time. It's just a scary time to see them so feverish on this imperialism. Do you feel some folks have different sentiments on it? Some people are very concerned, like, "Oh no, this is gonna." Some folks are like, "Oh, this is gonna bankrupt us." How are you? Where do you stand?
Well, from a historical standpoint, it it is pretty clear that empires that vastly overspend on military expenditure collapse from within. Um, and it's not because of social cultural war issues like I heard growing up and in my 20s, that the Roman Empire, for example, collapsed because of all the gayness happening. Right. It wasn't uh overextending and growing too large. It wasn't overspending on military expenditure. It wasn't things like grain production falling and things like that. No, it was because there were gay people, which is, it's laughably absurd, but that's the same kind of thinking that goes into Christian nationalism, Project 2025. Kevin Roberts is the president of the Heritage Foundation. He wrote the introduction to that. He's got a PhD in history. If he had turned that into me as a history teacher, I'd have given him an F. It is so full of ahistorical nonsense and poorly argued nonsense, but it panders to the base. And what they're saying is that America will be great when we eliminate transgenderism, which is a slur, by the way. Google it. And or kids knowing that gay people exist, or woke culture warrior ideologies, in which they're misappropriating a term that came from the African American community because of systemic racism, which they also say doesn't exist. And so all of these things are tied in together. And but what we're seeing is, I think, in some ways, our last gasp efforts to maintain this rigidly tight control on power. I think that the current regime is in a more tenuous position than they think they are. And I think that they're overplaying their hand, and that at some point justice will be served. All fascist regimes collapse. Sometimes it takes longer than others, but our country is so big and so wildly diverse, geographically diverse, culturally diverse, etc., ethnically diverse, that it's going to be hard for a minoritarian, authoritarian government to maintain their grip. I I pray that my prayer is that these fascists in this kakistocracy of idiots, power-hungry idiots, will be held fully accountable for every crime that they've committed, every unconstitutional act that they've committed, and for covering up a pedophile sex trafficking ring, which they are actively doing. All of which you would think that Christians would be praying alongside me and asking for that to happen. And yet here we have, again, in the last election, I think it was still close to 80% of white evangelicals voted for a man who admitted in 2005, and then the tapes were released in 2015 or 16, the Access Hollywood tapes, that he routinely sexually assaults women. And that wasn't enough for them. And that, breaks my heart and infuriates me at the same time. So I see things, I don't want to be like a pro-collapse person, right? Because so many people are not ready for that, and so many people would be harmed, if not killed by that. And I'm talking about the collapse of, say, U.S. superpower status or ecological collapse on our closed biosphere, because we're reaching tipping points that there's no going back from. And these things, we still have time on in certain ways, but we need to collectively as a country plug in our common sense mechanisms, because none of this makes sense. Saying that you are the leader of the entire hemisphere, as Donald Trump has recently done, because as Heather Cox Richardson has opined recently, he's trying to carve the world up into spheres of influence alongside Vladimir Putin and President Xi of China. And it is just for Trump, it's a white supremacist, imperialistic colonialism mindset. A lot of what he does comes from sort of the late 19th, early 20th century sort of worldview, which, again, I wish Americans would study history more, because studying history is what radicalized me, and then reading the words in red in my Bible. So the words of Jesus and the study of history, I became a son of thunder.
Yeah.
I,
Oh, yeah.
I think Jesus would definitely call me a son of thunder, and every once in a while want to rein me in. But these things have solutions, and we need a more collective will to enact these solutions. We need both bottom up and top down, because that's the world we live in. We live in a world of top down sort of power, but we also have collective power from the bottom up. That's how democracy is ostensibly supposed to work. And despite the fact that America has not even for one day of its 250-year history ever lived up to its idealistic rhetoric, it's still an ideal that people believe in, and it takes work. Just like putting in a garden takes work. We need to get busy. I've said this multiple times recently, because I read it recently, that a third of people in Nazi Germany were firmly behind Hitler. A third were firmly against him, but then the other third did nothing and just tried to go about their day and get by and not worry about it too much. We don't have the luxury of doing that. We do not have the luxury of allowing a third of the country to just sit idly by while Christo-fascists try to destroy the nation and the world, while they're murdering innocent people in the streets or in ICE detention centers. There's another homicide investigation now because of a Cuban immigrant who died in ICE custody by being choked out. We can't have this. And there's a straight line, unfortunately, from the Reconstruction era post-Civil War to 2026. And I'm still mad at Andrew Johnson, the president after Lincoln was assassinated, because that idiot was a white supremacist, and he did not, and he kind of put the kibosh on any of the radical Reconstructionists, like Thaddeus Stevens, who's from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was a radical Reconstructionist. His grave is like a mile from where I'm sitting. And Andrew Johnson was just like, no, let's just let the Confederate treasonist white supremacists just reintegrate into society. And the next thing you know, we got Jim Crow and segregation and lynchings and all of that goes with it. And now we've got a president and an entire administration that's saying that we can't teach history correctly because it's woke. And what we really need to do is praise white people. It's maddening.
It is, and it really goes to show how fragile it is. Like running an
Yeah.
empire, trying to be the dominant is like the dominant privileged culture is it's exhausting. One of the things I was looking at, I had the opportunity to go to Pakistan or Pakistan, depending on how you pronounce it. Um, but I read quite a bit about their civil war back in the 1940s and how Pakistan separated from India because both were under British rule. And then enough folks in the middle class of India had been educated on Western liberalism and were like, well, we want independence too, obviously. And they wanted independence for themselves anyway. But like, um, and Britain was willing to give it up because they were broke from the world wars and because running an empire was so expensive. And it was talking about the propaganda, how much money Britain was spending to have troops over there, the
Mm-hmm.
propaganda, the culture, like so much. And it's exhausting. Um, I certainly hope, like you said, this is a last grasp effort because, my goodness, it feels very, like I said, feverish and very like teenage boy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and even the way that Pete Hegseth was talking about was speaking in his speech to all the generals that he had
Oh my gosh,
fly.
that was so embarrassing for him.
Yeah, right. Like, it's not a calm, cool collectedness. It's
No.
like a Lord of the Flies type thing.
Yeah.
And I just, I don't know. I just wanted I guess I'm disappointed because I wanted evil to be smarter or something. Like,
Right. Yeah. Or because the evil is so stupid, and that's what kakistocracy kind of means. The rule by the least qualified or the most inept, and that's what we see. And these inept people also happen to be fascist. So that is a terrible combination. And I often describe Stephen Miller as having xenophobic fever dreams. So I'm right there with you with the feverishness of this, or the um, dispensationalist having their rapture fever dreams, which those people, dispensationalism doesn't, it's not in the Bible. It is a 19th century thing from John Nelson Darby. But there are dispensationalists like Mike Huckabee, who is now the ambassador to Israel. And Mike Huckabee's MO is to try to make the rapture happen. Well, you can't make a non-thing happen. But what you can do is get a lot of people fucking killed
right.
in
Yeah.
the
You
name
can't.
of this thing.
Right.
And that's why there's so much unequivocal support for the nation state of Israel, because again, God's on our side. Therefore, if we're trying to manipulate Israel or support a genocide that's happening in Israel, it's okay because Jesus is going to come back. And it's like these two toxic entities playing off of each other. Netanyahu's far right radicals in the Likud, and then uh, the dispensationalists and the Christian nationalists who are trying to make the rapture happen. And Jesus said, "By your fruit you'll be known." Well, what fruit is that bearing? Well, all you have to do is look at what's happening in Gaza right now to know that there's no fruit there.
Right.
That's all rotten, putrefying, disgusting satanicness. that's happening over there, all in the name of these feverish, ahistorical, anti-Bible, anti-Jesus movements that are being foisted upon the world. Um, Trump and his regime are not just dangerous to people in Minnesota; they're dangerous to the entire planet because of the aforementioned environmental stuff that they don't believe in and that they're ramping up. What was it? Mike Johnson was just saying people are buying big trucks again. How stupid do you have to be to think that that's a good idea? With a dwindling resource that is, again, Heather Cox Richardson said, that's 19th and early 20th century technology, folks. We're grasping onto this ancient thing that doesn't make any sense anymore, that's also destroying the planet. It's so mind-numbingly stupid. And yet these are the people in power, and they so often just go out there and they bold-faced lie to and gaslight the nation and the world. And so these people are dangerous to the entire planet.
I appreciated what you said, like, they're so focused on creating some rapture that or, they're so focused on the rapture that they're gonna wind up triggering a nuclear winter.
Right. It's
That's and it's so upsetting for everyone else because 'cause we're like, "No," and
yeah,
especially for folks like you and me who still identify as Christian and know that that is just one interpretation out of a lot of others, and you're like, "That's the one that took off?"
yeah.
And,
By
but
a
it's
Scottish guy who couldn't get his ideas to take off elsewhere, so he brought them to America. And now and the funny thing is that a lot of Christian nationalists are not dispensationalist. They're dominionist.
right.
So we've got these dueling theological ideas that start with D, and so the dominionists are like, we have to create this theocratic top-down thing, and only then will, when everybody's a Christian nationalist, then Jesus will return. I'm sorry. Did, where did you come up with that idea? It's not in the Gospels. And Jesus said if he wanted to, he could call down legions of angels if he stubbed his toe. So how do you add that up and go, yeah, dominionism is how we're going to make Jesus come back? None of it makes theological sense. I don't know who needs to hear this, but the early Jesus movement was poor people, mostly working class peasants, who were under the occupying force of the most brutal empire in the world at that time. This was not a power hungry, powerful movement. It was a movement of the powerless in the face of imperial power. But Christian nationalists, be they dispensationalist or dominionist, think that it's about power over. And I don't know what gospels they're reading. Hell, I don't even know if they've read Paul. But they quote Paul a lot, but I don't think they understand Paul that well either. And most of what they quote from Paul is not actually written by Paul. Spoiler alert.
Um, and at the end of the day, Paul was a man of his time, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's like it's the same reason, like, yeah, there's a lot of great things Paul did. There's also a lot of great things that Thomas Jefferson did that I also look at, I'm like, that was of your time and not like potentially and just like I don't just yeah, it's a different you have Paul is Paul's got layers, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
people that like to take the top layer, and even the top layer's not good enough either, like you said. Like some of it, you're like, you're making stuff up on that top layer.
Right.
So,
I mean,
but
and Paul sometimes said, look, this is my opinion. But how many times did he write something and didn't preface it with, this is just my opinion? I'm
right.
sure his opinion appears in everything that he literally wrote. Um, but then in the Deuteropauline books like Colossians and Ephesians and the pastoral letters, which most scholars think that he didn't actually write for a variety of reasons, there are things that are absolutely contradictory to what he did right. And that's a lot of the things that that the Christo-fascists use to weaponize the Bible against people that they're intending to marginalize, like women or people of color or the LGBTQ plus community. They're using these things as weapons by taking them wildly out of context and attributing them to somebody who almost certainly didn't actually write them, while ignoring the things that he did write, and like about women in ministry or leadership, praying and prophesying, etc., as he said, or being deacons, uh, like he talks about in Romans, and they just whoosh right over that because it's not about accuracy for them. It's about finding an excuse for their authoritarian tendencies, finding some reason to justify them. And they can look at the Bible, and you used the word theonomy earlier, and that's a big one for the Wilson crowd, for the community of Reformed evangelical churches, of which Pete Hegseth is a part. And that's using the Hebrew Bible's particularly most punitive aspects and applying it to civil law. They talk about civil magistrates all the time, these folks. And there's nothing in the Bible that talks about civil magistrates that I know of. This is something that they're taking from Calvin, who, man, if there's a dude that I wished had taken a different path in life, it's John Calvin. I really wish Calvin had been like, you know what? I think I'm going to be a painter, or I'm just going to stick to the law, and I'm not going to force my ridiculous views onto other people. And I might get in trouble for this, but I cannot stand Calvinism as a theology. The idea that God preordained some people to just fry in hell forever. That's not a God that's worth worship or adoration. And it's not, I don't think it's a God that's represented in the text either. I just, Calvinist. I just
No,
can't with
and
those guys.
I mean, there's a lot, predestination spiky, a lot of people,
Yeah,
and don't or have a lot of questions about it, and that's the concern when, like we said, we've got this feverish Lord of the Flies Department of War, right? We have changed it from Department of Defense into Department of War. We have made a statement with that. We are going on the
yeah.
offensive, um,
And how fragile is
and
your masculinity if you have to go around puffing yourself up and going, I'm the secretary of the Department of War, we're lethal, It's like, dude, go to therapy.
Go to and it's like you said, it's this 19th or 20th century, like very much. I know that there's already a book on this, but like John Wayne, like it's like
Yeah,
the old way of being a man, like this masculine man, when like it's just it's like a cartoon or something,
yeah, it's a
and
caricature. And again, it's Jesus broke some of those norms, talking to women that he wasn't ostensibly supposed to talk to, looking at the Pharisee and going, do you see this woman? As if he's saying, do you see the humanity of this person that you just keep calling a sinner in your mind and cringing in your mind because she's here mopping my feet with her hair and perfume? But you don't see her humanity. And Jesus saw the humanity of women. Paul talked about having women in leadership in the Christian movement as co-equals, not as, this hierarchy thing. And Hegseth likes to talk about all this, pseudo-masculine nonsense. And to me, that just speaks to his fragility, but also the fact that he's a known abuser. He uses a lot of language that sounds like something an abuser would say, and the reason is because we know he's abused people. His mom sent that letter to him that became public about his misogyny, his philandering, and all of those kinds of things. And that's what we see from this movement. And it's antithetical to everything that Jesus taught. And it just makes you look silly and stupid.
Right. Like
I mean,
cringe.
and
Eh,
yeah, and so cringeworthy.
Like, um, well, thank you for going down such a deep dive with me today. One of the things that I thought about when we were talking about how bad war is for the environment is all of this stuff with the border and building a border wall, or whether
Right.
it's the construction of the border wall, how the wall is impacting wildlife. I had an opportunity to meet with some indigenous folks whose reservation crosses the border of the United States and Mexico, and they can't access parts of their own lands. Like, they're like, we're not even part of this. Like, what are we doing here? And then when you get to the Rio Grande on the Texas side, there's all these, like, floating spiked balls, like, it's the most and it looks ugly and bad, and it feels that way, this dehumanizing mark across our southern border. And like you said, again, like, America is so precious. We need to have all this military. We need to have these borders. We got to keep all these. And it's just like, wow, we've really lost everyone's humanity. So it's been
Yeah.
really nice to hear you come back on and speak out against it and feel angry and be angry because we are. But is there anywhere that where can I push my followers to learn more about you and the God Squad, or wherever else the Tattooed Theologian can be?
Yeah, well, my blog is called The Tattooed Theologian. The God Squad pod is on most major podcast platforms. We just released a new episode this morning. And I'm on social media on Threads and Blue Sky is the Tattooed Theologian, or you can just look up my name on Facebook, Dillon Naber Cruz. I have a public profile and an author profile there. So I'm all over the internet, and my books are on Amazon. It's unfortunate, but there it is. You know, you publish with publishers, and they put them where they put them, and that's where they put them. So you can find Theological Musings, Collected Essays of a Tattooed Theologian, Volumes 1 and 2, and Go Golden from there. You can find Go Golden elsewhere too if Amazon's not your thing. But yeah, check out the God Squad pod. We shine the light on Christian nationalism and culture war issues and people like Chad Bianco, who I featured last night, who should never ever be the governor of California. If your listeners in California, check out that episode because his campaign website does not mention anything about his Christian nationalist beliefs or faith or anything. So it's like he's trying to hide that part of himself from potential voters. And I find that to be disingenuous and disgusting.
Well, thank you so much. Dillon Naber Cruz, everybody, Tattooed Theologian, former Marine. Thank you for your service. Author and holder of a master's in religion. Such a great chat today. Thank you. Folks, tune in next time for another episode of Follow the Leader. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until then, I'll see you later. Bye bye.